Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman will be presenting Budget 2021. Today, the most challenging budget perhaps in the recent times. And in our own words, we are all expecting a budget like never before. On one hand, Finance Minister urgently needs to revive the Indian economy, which is battered first by a slowdown, then by a pandemic, and a slowdown effectively becoming a recession. On the other hand, all are expecting government to boost spending and demand by bringing in some relief for all kinds of taxpayers. Then, of course, there is tackling the jobs crisis that's been plaguing the country long before the pandemic hit us, and it's only been worsened by the lockdown. Focus also, we are hoping, will be on the COVID hit sectors and the industries that are now looking towards the government for more relief beyond the Atmanirbhar stimulus package that was announced. So we're going to get you really a roundup of what are the expectations, what we believe can be the focus and should be the focus for the government in such times. And starting now, it will be a roundup with experts, economists, senior financial journalists, political representatives who will be joining us. Let me first say good morning to Vinay Tiwari, who will be with me through the day in our studios, our managing editor. We are also being joined by Gopal Krishna Agarwal of the BJP, Pallavi Sharma of the Congress Party, Mr. Siraj Hussain, former Agriculture Secretary, M.K. Venu, founding editor of The Wire. But before I go across to panelists, let's set the tone for this conversation and let's go across to Avni Raja, who's actually going to be in the newspit through the day and will be getting us all the updates and special elements that we've designed to get the conversation going. First, of course, Vinay, the focus has to be on, what are we going in with? The fact that it's been an unprecedented year, really. And the hopes from Finance Minister are also unprecedented.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're expecting magic. I don't know how much headroom she has for that kind of magic, but I don't envy her at all. I mean, I don't think anyone else would want to be in her position that she is in today. To use a cricketing analogy, my favorite one, I mean, this is a very unusual game where the pitch has slowed down. It is also spinning. The ball is also jumping up. We don't know how it's going to play in the next few sessions. The bowling is fairly hostile. And there are, very difficult field placements all around the government. So all in all, this is possibly the toughest task the government has undertaken, I think, in the last 7-8 years, ever since the India government came to power. Certainly, this is the most difficult budget in many ways because you have lots of problems and there aren't enough solutions for all of them. Now, how does one balance between the two? Will it be a budget like we've never seen before? Or, as the Prime Minister then later on slightly tempered it down by saying, expect a more continuation of the kind of schemes that were announced during the pandemic and during the lockdown. Right. What will it be? I think we've never had a bigger suspense than we've had today.
And I'm sure this morning it's also playing on the mind of Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. The first budget that she actually came out with, there was quite a bit of backlash and pushback from the industry. And effectively, a few months down the line, a lot of what was announced had to be undone. And that was 2 years ago. And then the next budget that was announced effectively had to be undone because we went into a pandemic mode and priorities had to be realigned. The entire plan had to be realigned. So the third time around, it's going to be interesting what she comes out with.
Absolutely. And I think one of the bigger problems that you have for this year is that there isn't also enough cogent data available to measure what success one measure had or not. I mean, there is some data, of course, available. But a lot of the data in terms of, various indices is not available. So it's very difficult to assess, even over a last 2-year period, of which scheme actually ended up benefiting how much. And, however much we may argue against it, the fact is that data is one of the biggest factors in determining allocations and, of course, the efficacy of allocations. Without authentic, solid data analysis, it's very difficult to understand if your money that you're allocating is good money or bad money, because you can make allocations, but those allocations actually worked, trickle down to the last mile that you expect it to, is what determines the success of any scheme. So yes, that again is a challenge. And
the same data can be interpreted in many ways.
It can be interpreted in many ways. It can
still be your version versus mine, which is why we will be having an exhaustive set of experts through the day helping us before and after the budget to really analyze where we stand. Let me go across to Avni Raja to put this more in perspective. Avni, the big 5 challenges that Finance Minister faces today, take us through them.
Yes, absolutely, Tanvi. Good morning. Now, of course, there are multiple challenges that are going to be facing the finance minister in this particular budget. So here are some of the biggest challenges that we are talking about. First of all, reviving growth, creating jobs, spurring demand, spending and fiscal balance. That balance is going to be very important as well. And obviously, the entire overhaul of the health infrastructure. Now, just to, put all of these are interlinked in one way or the other, but just to throw a little more light, let's look at each challenge here, starting with the growth part of it. Now, we do know that this year we're going to be seeing a contraction. We might get into the positive territory by the fourth quarter of this financial year, that is the Jan to March period. But nonetheless, for the entire year, it is going to be a negative growth a negative, a contraction that we're going to see as far as the economy is concerned. So in Q1, we saw minus 23.9%. In Q2, it was minus 7%. And for the entire year, it is likely to be minus 7.7%. So this is going to be the key, because this is going to be what will drive the economy going forward. That's the first big challenge, and what the government is going to do to ensure, growth comes back. The second challenge, of course, is now creating jobs. And this is going to be the most important part of it, because there have been millions of jobs that have been lost in this entire year. More than 38 million jobs have been lost so far in December alone. The unemployment rate was highest in December at about 9.1%. And that's been the highest unemployment since June. So even though the economy is, recovering, the unemployment rate is, has been rising. The other part, of course, is spurring demand. This is obviously linked to the demand, to the economy, to the growth, all of that, jobs. And this is also crucial, because how is the government going to ensure that demand comes back? Consumer confidence is not very strong right now. Whether it's going to be putting more money into people's hand, incentives in the form of taxation, obviously increasing the number of jobs. All of these are, ways that the government needs to look at to sort of increase demand. And then you, of course, have the spending and fiscal balance that needs to be maintained. Now, all experts, as I'm sure on the panel also will tell you, that fiscal, is not so important right now, the fiscal deficit target at this point in time, because the spending is what is most important. But at the same time, the government has to ensure that it doesn't spiral out of control, because eventually we will have to come back and get the fiscal deficit number back under control. So what are the other ways that the government can shore up revenues? Increasing the focus on disinvestments is the other aspect as well. And finally, of course, very importantly, the health infrastructure overhaul. So far, we just have about more than 1% of GDP that is spent on health infrastructure. So hopefully this pandemic, which has brought to the forefront a lot of issues with respect to our health infrastructure, those issues will be taken into consideration, and we might see innovative ways of improving health infrastructure across the entire country. Tanvi.
All right, Avni, thanks so much for really putting that in perspective. Let me just straight away take it across to the panelists who are joining us right now. And I actually want to start off with Mr. M.K. Venu. Mr. Venu, often the media is blamed for, hyping up the budget before and after. But this time around, do you think it's worth pinning a lot of our hopes on what can be done with this budget exercise?
Well, Tanvi, you're right. India is probably the only advancing emerging economy, you might, if you want to describe India like that, where budget is such a big event, such a big publicized event. I don't think budgets are discussed or anticipated or speculated upon so much in other emerging economies like China, Brazil, South Korea, other peers. So while what you say is true, this year particularly budget is more eagerly awaited, Tanvi, in order to figure what will the finance ministry or the government do in terms of kickstarting demand. Because so far, Tanvi, in the last during the pandemic, what we have seen is government has come up with a lot of supply side measures, in the sense that they have bulk of the 20 lakh crore stimulus package had to do with providing credit to the MSME sector, providing relief to the corporate balance sheets, as I would describe it. So corporates have gained a lot. Corporates have reduced their interest costs. Interest rates have gone down. RBI has done a good job of providing a lot of liquidity in the system. And before the pandemic, you might remember, Tanvi, the corporate sector had got in 2019 got a huge stimulus in terms of a corporate tax cut. So corporate taxes were reduced to, for new investment 15%, otherwise 25%. Massive. There was a massive boost for the corporate sector. Again, supply side company balance sheets, Tanvi, have improved, of particularly of big companies. But the household balance sheets are still very weak, are still suffering. People's incomes have suffered during pandemic.
Correct.
Employment levels are still down. There are surveys which show that that's nearly 70% of those employed have either partially got their salaries have been reduced, or 50%, 35 to 50% salary loss. Now, all this put together, what it tells us is the economy will not pick up unless we generate demand, unless people go out and buy.
Yes.
Now, this has been stated by none other than the economist, not economist, a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Nilesh Shah, who's a corporate sector guy. He works for Kotak, mutual fund. He heads Kotak's mutual fund division.
Correct.
He actually came on in an interview to The Wire. He said that the corporate sector cannot revive investments at the moment because the revival of demand has to come from the household sector.
Yeah.
So household sector needs to start spending. Now that is what this budget has to figure. And I don't know how she will do it, whether she'll put more money in the hands of people.
So, Mr. Venu, let me pick up that point, because that's a very interesting point that you made. And in fact, you very correctly said that's for many of the corporates, at least the big corporates, their balance sheets have improved. But honestly, if a lot of it has come at the cost of a dent on the household balance sheets, because people have either lost jobs or have had to face salary cuts and had to do, face the brunt of it for many of the big corporates to sustain and get through this crisis. So then, Gopal Agarwal, I won't put you in a spot by asking you exactly what can be announced today, but let me ask you to help us understand what's the idea with which we are getting into this budget announcement today.
Thank you, Tanvi. Taking cue from Mr. Venu, I would like to just say two things, important point that economic survey has also brought. That you don't push demand when there is a supply constraint. And COVID had been one of the biggest challenge where supply constraint had come from, because many of the industries were not working. The supply chain was disrupted. Lot of things had put restrictions on the supply side. So unless the supply side regains, if you push demand, it will not help. So what had now that the supply constraint has been removed, the government did push for the government spending. In the November, we saw the increase in the government spending to the tune of 248%. So now the thing is that the government will now push further in the demand, creating demand. Second important point I would like to mention here is that many people were criticizing government that government had not announced one large chunk of stimulus in one go. We did was staggering the stimulus packages, and that has also helped. Those sectors which required support at any particular point of time, government gave stimulus to that sector. And initial was to push money into the rural and agriculture sector, which was in deep distress in the initial phase of COVID. Then second was the unorganized sector. Large chunk of money was pushed through bank and other channels into the unorganized sectors, and from there the economic growth has come out. We are seeing that there is a growth of 3.4% in the agriculture sector. Now the thing is that also I agree with Mr. Venu that and you also said that the fiscal deficit will not be a big constraint for the government. Government will continue spending. And if you look into the current status, the economic recovery is quite encouraging and strong. And that gives us confidence that now we have to sustain this economic recovery. Unless we catalyze this further, we sustain this. And from here, we are borrowing, fiscal deficit, inflation, these constraints will not bog down the finance minister, and now
well, it's
we
good to
will
hear, Mr.
put
Gopal
more money
Agarwal, the BJP is saying this because I think for far too long we've heard that, well, we don't have the money, we have our own constraints, revenues are down, and the government can only do so much. So at least what you're saying, and I know you've now been mentioning this for the last couple of weeks, at least that you've had joined us for conversations, that shows that the government now understands and is willing to spend more than what it may be earning. And that effectively is an operative point to focus on. Mr. Siraj Hussain, what Gopal Agarwal was saying, a lot of government's initial response was to focus on the rural sector. During the pandemic and the lockdown, the poor, the vulnerable, the agri sector and the rural sector, to what extent do you think we were able to tackle the problem at hand? And now, how do we take it from short-term relief to a long-term revival?
See, generally speaking, we can say that agriculture was not much affected by COVID-19 pandemic. Primarily due to the wherewithal of our farmers. However, in the last few months, I can say that the mood in the agriculture sector is very somber, and it is extremely conservative, because even the journalists who have been covering the farming sector have been arrested. So there is a lot of concern, more concern about that rather than the budget,
yes,
as far as the farming sector is concerned. But I must say that I would like to see in the budget a large allocation for agriculture marketing, because it is feared that the government now wants the APMCs to wither away. So the government should show by making a large allocation that it would rather invest in agriculture marketing, so that the facilities for APMCs actually improve and farmers realize a better price for their produce when they bring it to the APMC markets.
Let me in fact ask you to elaborate a little bit more on this, Mr. Siraj Hussain, and simplify it for our viewers. When you say spend more on agricultural marketing, what all does that entail?
Basically, what it means is that the APMC mandis should have better infrastructure for drying, sorting, cleaning, grading, packaging, storage. You see what happens. Take the example of Punjab or Bihar. Of course, Bihar has no mandis, so there is nothing which one can expect in Bihar. But let us take Punjab. You know, when maize comes to the market, it has very high moisture because it has been harvested just after the monsoon season. So the APMC should have dryers, but very few APMCs have dryers, as a result of which the farmers are forced to sell at much below the MSP. So this year the MSP for maize was 1850 per quintal. Farmers sold it for 1100 or 1200 rupees per quintal. Similarly, the facilities for grading, especially for fruits and vegetables, they are hardly existing in most APMCs. So while the government may expect that private sector will come and invest, it will, in my view. I've written about it, but I think it is the government which has to invest in APMCs, especially for perishables, because in my view, and I have written about it, it is unlikely that the corporates will come and invest in fresh perishable sector. They would much rather be interested in more expensive non-perishable sector like pulses, etc., where they can make more profits.
Oh yes, absolutely. Vinay, before I go to Palvi, this is an important aspect that has been raised, and we've also repeatedly spoken about it, that when we're trying to open up the markets, the agri markets, and at the end of the day trying and helping the farmers, we have to ensure that the necessary setup is there, the necessary infrastructure is there to really enable it going, and that's something that the government will really need to step up on.
Oh, absolutely. And look, for me, the big worry is this. We've never, ever looked at agriculture sector reforms in the last 60 years or so. And the biggest misfortune now is that the first attempt that was made by the government by introducing these three laws have run into all kinds of controversies. And that, to me, is a double whammy. The first whammy is that it slightly puts a roadblock on any more bold reforms the government may have been thinking. And the second part of the double whammy is that I have a sense that the government may slightly overspend on farm sector this year, in a difficult year, simply because they now need to also show a political message. Because, you know, we've been arguing and debating about it for a long time. Budgets are also political exercises. They're not just economic exercises. And I have a feeling the government will feel that pressure because they've just run into a difficult situation with the farmers. The narrative is very awkward out there. And I'm sure that the government's budgetary announcements would try and look at that sector way more carefully, and though it would have been required. But in this year, the challenges are just way too many. There's a healthcare challenge, there is a spending challenge, there's an infra challenge, there's a real estate. There's virtually every sector is in a challenge right now.
Yeah.
So that, I hope, doesn't weigh too much on the mind of the government. I hope we still look at it professionally the way we have. But for me, the big worry is that the boldness of reforms in the agriculture sector, which should have happened long back, may get a little stunted with what has happened over the last 3 months or so.
Well, that's MOS Finance there, praying early in the day before he, along with the finance minister, go in with their budget and present it to the parliament and to the country. Anurag Thakur on your screens. Pallavi, at the end of the day, you know it and I know it, Congress party will find some of the other issues with this budget. But let's begin this morning by asking you what it is that your party expects the government to do. It's a tough task, so many issues to address. Prioritizing will be a challenge.
See, Tanvi, I don't think it's about finding faults at the end of the day. You know, the Congress party is fully aware that at present nothing is going well for this government. You see the farmers' protests, they started from Punjab, they've spread to Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, and now they've spread like wildfire to other parts of the country as well, right? Then you have China on one side, which has dug its heels deep into the Indian territory and is refusing to leave. So the Congress party is fully aware that this is a very strenuous situation for the government right now, right? But having said that, you know, also it's important to mention the fact, since everybody on the panel spoke about how the pandemic has hit the economy. But we must not forget and let the people of this country also know that even without the pandemic, if you see, the economy had started going in a downward spiral, even when the pandemic had not started. So in the first quarter of 2018 and 2019, we saw the pandemic started going, the economy started going downward. It continued for 8 successive quarters till 31st March 2020. And we must also not forget that the current finance minister also has the distinction of being the only finance minister in the last 40 years to, present the budget of an economy that is in recession. The Indian economy has not gone in recession for the last 40 years. Then it has gone now. So we've seen in the first quarter, and we also have the IMF chief now come out and say that things will only be pre-COVID or in pre-pandemic situation only in 2025 for India, right? So right now, the Congress party, keeping all these scenarios in mind, all we wish for, because we see there is a universal demand for 2 sectors where the government needs to pump in funds. One is the health infrastructure, and second is the defense. I think both these sectors the government should keep priority because there is a universal demand for funds to be pumped in both these sectors right now. So that's what we're hoping for right now. Let's see what the government does. And let's also hope that it does not become a disaster like the 2020 and the 2021 budget, because the finance minister herself had to come out and unroll a lot of announcements that she had made.
No, that is true. And that was because of a large amount of backlash that came in. And then the second time around, obviously, we went into a pandemic and it's lockdown, so things had to be redone again. So there is a lot riding this time around. Gopal Agarwal, would you like to respond to what the Congress party is saying?
I would like to say 2 things. One thing is that when Vinayji was saying, I would like to respond to that agri reforms, the current status will have a hampering effect on what the government will do for reforms. I would like to say to his comment that these reforms, etc., are coming from convictions, not compulsions alone. And those convictions show that agriculture reform, the 3 reforms, are urgently required, and we are committed to those reforms, though we will give some space for the farmers' concern, but overall we firmly believe that these agriculture reforms are good for the agriculture sector, and we are committed to doubling farmers' income, and this will be a strong step in that direction. One thing. Second thing is, the Prime Minister has said that we are seeing a series of multiple smaller budgets over the period from starting of COVID. And the health and the wealth, these two sectors have been brought out very strongly after the COVID crisis, and the government has sufficiently taken care of all these sectors. And it is not just that in isolation that this recovery, etc., are coming. So we are committed as a party for reforms. They will continue, and budget is one milestone in that reform process. We have labor reforms on the card, then many policy reforms, etc., all those things. The importance of V-shaped recovery is that the sustainability has to, the challenge is to sustain that. And this will be a major step in this direction. That's what I would like to say.
Okay.
And IMF and other RBI report, IMF report, Ministry of Finance monthly economic monitor report, PMI data, IIP data, all show that the corporate results across segment, automobile, IT, infrastructure, cement, steel sector, all are showing very healthy growth and GST figures now. So these are the strengths on which we will build the figures. And when there is no, we are not taking into consideration about fiscal deficit and the borrowing at current level, because economic survey says that interest rate and GDP growth rate, etc., inflation and fiscal deficit have to be balanced and there has to be a counter-cyclical measure.
Yeah.
So we are going to do that. When we will require further focus on fiscal stimulus, we will do it. So I think we have sufficiently good roadmap, and our staggering of the stimulus package has also contributed to the sectors which require at one particular point of time support.
Yes,
from the
but
government.
a lot of that, Mr. Gopal Agarwal, was actually help them sustain in the short term, to borrow more, to have some cash in hand, to continue with their businesses and somehow survive when the business is in a lockdown setup. But clearly you know it and I know it, the demand is that more than enabling them to borrow, we have to figure out now other ways of restarting economy and saving the businesses. Saving lives part is done, saving livelihoods and restarting economy is the other part. I'm going to take a very short break. I request our panelists to stay on with us. Lots more to chat about on the other side. We'll also get you the latest updates and quick comments coming in from MOS Finance. Stay with me.